Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to keep week 93 of the TTT going as we continue in our time in the letters for Tolkien Tuesdays. Now, last week we saw Tolkien discuss the financial challenges of forced retirement, take a long-delayed vacation, realize that he needed to get to work on Sir Gawain, and reveal just how he felt about Siamese cats. Today, we'll move into the year 1960, starting with 5 all-new letters in this revised and expanded edition. Now, letter 222A is a reply to Rayner Unwin. The background for this letter is that a librarian had prepared 3 lists of names, places, and words from The Lord of the Rings. Unwin had forwarded these lists to Tolkien, who wrote back, "I did sit down promptly and dutifully to the Scunthorpe lists, but I found that any attempt to correct them or explain them landed me in difficulty, and actually revealed many points in the general structure of names, etc. I really want to see these lists." Tolkien then said that he would return them shortly, quote, "with only minor notes." But Tolkien is keen to point out that he's not just been enjoying retirement. He says to Unwin, "Time has not been wasted. I have done a great deal of work on the Silmarillion, largely as a consequence of thinking about the points raised." That makes a great deal of sense when you think about just how deeply the languages are connected to the Silmarillion material. And in a theme that we'll see throughout the rest of his life, his focus is very much on the Silmarillion. He writes, "I think the Silmarillion might now be described accurately as in an active state of preparation, thanks largely to my present secretary." Well, that led me to try to find out who his secretary was at this point, but I have to tell you I'm not entirely certain. The Tolkien Collector's Guide has a summary of letters. In fact, it includes letters still not published. And there's one from Tolkien's secretary, A.M. Hope, to Rayner Unwin. But that's dated in February of the previous year, 1959. And I know that later in the 1960s, Joy Hill becomes Tolkien's secretary. But I don't think she is in 1960. At this point, she's not yet his secretary. So it's a mystery. But whoever it is, they're helping Tolkien prepare the Silmarillion material. As for the Scunthorpe lists, we don't see them again in the letters, but Skull and Hammond's chronology reveals that on April 25th, Rayner Unwin followed up again asking about them. Tolkien wrote back on May 5th that he'd done nothing about the Scunthorpe lists for a long time, explaining that when I first worked at it, it revealed to me that a good deal of work on the nomenclature and linguistic elements in The Lord of the Rings was needed, and I have done that. But to deal with the Scunthorpe indices would either mean voluminous notes, for which I have not time, or a few casual corrections, which now seem ungenerous after so much delay. It will have to be the latter, and I will see to it. Moving on to letter 222B, it's another letter to Rayner Unwin. Just 3 days later, on February 12th, Tolkien shifts gears to talk about his Middle English translations. He writes, "With regard to Gawain and Pearl, action is only for the moment deferred until we get all the present Silmarillion material typed out and arranged." Why do I think this means an even longer delay, actually? Tolkien continues, "This is nearly complete." If only that were true. He goes on, "I shall then correct the translations of Pearl and Gawain. At least that was my intention until a few days ago, when the proofs of the Ancrena Visa, more than a year delayed by printing strikes and other troubles, began suddenly to descend on me. At any rate, I am in for a Middle English interval, evidently." Later that month, in letter 222C, Tolkien writes again to Rayner Unwin, asking, "Would you have any objection to me publishing any separate or minor items belonging to the Ring cycle?" He says he's often asked for small minor contributions, and being offered good money for those writings. Tolkien continues, "The things I have in mind are not integral parts of the Silmarillion, and for some of them it is very likely that no place will be found in that work. But I suppose I could publish them without in any way affecting the question of their inclusion in the major work, if necessary. I've done some digging. Okay, quite a bit of digging. I can't find precisely what Tolkien was referring to here. So if anybody listening or watching to the TTT today knows what small minor contributions Tolkien was being given good offers for, please let me know. That is some fascinating stuff." Now, next, he writes to his publisher on March 1st. "I've now received 10 copies of Sagan om Ringen," that's the Swedish translation of The Lord of the Rings, "as I had 5 complimentary copies last year. I have no objection to this, though they are not going off exactly as hotcakes for presents, as Swedish does not seem to be one of the languages much indulged in England. I could send some back if there has been some mistake, and if this would not cost more time and trouble than it is worth. What does one do with 10 copies of a book you can't even give away? On April 4th, Tolkien wrote to his aunt Jane Neve and included an excerpt from the Silmarillion. This is 1960. I send you a long installment, together with what you have already seen, since you will need it for reference. I am afraid it is still in rather a muddle, as the matter is in process of being rewritten, but I hope it will give some idea of the scope of the whole. What follows may be more interesting, as I have not been able to put in order the material beyond the point this installment reaches. But you are now about to reach the main stories, for which all this other material is really only background. Did he send her what we now know of as the Ainulindale? Or maybe he was just providing background on the exile of the Noldor with the action happening in the next installments. Who knows, but this sure would have been interesting to read. Finally, in the last of these 5 new, albeit brief letters, Tolkien writes once more to Rayner Unwin on May 5th, in reply to a recent letter that included an account of sales and a large royalty payment. I have actually had very little time for connected work of any kind for some weeks. I have been engaged with various domestic troubles which I need not bother you with. I do give all the time I possibly can to the books which I have promised to you, though I begin to feel depressed by the amount of work still to do and the difficulty of getting any time for concentration. And given how hard Tolkien has worked for so long to get his legendarium to this point, it's hard to hear that he's feeling depressed. But I think we can all identify with having a large stack of work to do while facing circumstances that make it just about impossible to focus on that work. Tolkien continues more optimistically, "Your letter and the enclosure of 2nd May certainly cheered me up a great deal and will probably assist in getting me a little more leisure." Well, that is a good thing to hear. Also says this, "I think the inland revenue will get a much smaller share this time, as The Lord of the Rings and Hobbit are what I have at present mostly to live on. Stimulating their sales, therefore, has a more than artistic interest for me." Now, I don't know if that means royalty income was taxed at a different rate, or maybe it's that now that he's retired and not getting a regular paycheck from the university, he's in a less punishing tax bracket. Whatever the case, I'm glad that he's going to have more to enjoy, even if he doesn't have much time to enjoy it. For now, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week when we'll power through the rest of 1960, including Tolkien being lost in a bottomless bog and complaining about C.S. Lewis's ponderous silliness. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. Podcast listeners, please be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast apps. For those of you on YouTube, subscribe to this channel to get all of the PPP productions. And everybody, please follow @PrancingPonyPod on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.